The first thing my brother said after my father died was not, "I'm sorry." It was, "We need to figure out what we're doing with the apartment." I remember sitting in that attorney's office, looking at the same people I had spent my entire life trying to make proud, and realizing they had already divided up my father's final gift before anyone had even opened his estate file. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 38 years old, and 3 weeks after I buried my father, my own family tried to take the apartment he left behind. Not asked me, not discussed it with me. Take it from me. My older brother Daniel leaned back in his chair, like the decision had already been made. My mother Linda kept adjusting the pearl necklace she wore to every important family event. My younger sister Rachel looked uncomfortable, but she stayed quiet. Daniel looked at me and said, "Emily, you know this makes the most sense. I'm the one who can handle the property." The way he said it was almost gentle. That was what hurt the most, because my family had always learned how to make their selfishness sound like responsibility. I looked at the folder sitting in front of the estate attorney and said nothing. They thought my silence meant agreement. They thought I was still the daughter who would step aside, avoid conflict, and let everyone else decide what happened. But they didn't know my father had left something behind that none of them expected. They didn't know there was one final document that would change everything. And before I tell you how that happened, I want to say something. If you have ever felt like the person in your family who was always expected to give, always expected to understand, and always expected to stay quiet, this story may feel familiar. Because sometimes the deepest betrayal doesn't come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from the people who know exactly how much you have already sacrificed. But to understand why that moment in the attorney's office meant so much to me, I need to take you back to where everything started. I need to tell you about my family. Because the apartment was never just about property. It was about years of being overlooked. It was about a role I never chose but somehow spent my whole life trying to escape. And it all began with the Carter family. My father, Michael Carter, was the kind of man who believed hard work could solve almost anything. He built a successful contracting business from nothing. He spent years waking up before sunrise, wearing the same faded work jacket, and coming home exhausted but proud. He loved providing for us, but he also cared deeply about appearances. My mother, Linda, was the same way. She cared about what people thought of our family. She wanted neighbors to see us as successful, organized, and perfect. Inside our home, though, things were not always as perfect as they looked. I was the responsible daughter. That was the label everyone gave me. At first, I thought it was a compliment. I thought being the responsible one meant they trusted me, but over time I realized it meant something different. It meant I was the person everyone called when something needed to be fixed. My brother Daniel was always seen as the future of the family. He was the oldest, he was the son, and in my parents' eyes, those two things seemed to carry a weight I could never compete with. Whenever Daniel talked about a new plan, everyone listened. Whenever I talked about my own goals, someone usually changed the subject. Rachel, my younger sister, was treated like the fragile one. Everyone protected her feelings, everyone made excuses for her mistakes, and I became the person who was expected to understand. The apartment my father left behind was part of that complicated family history. It was where he lived during the final years of his life after he decided to downsize. It was the place where I spent countless evenings sitting beside him, helping with paperwork, arranging repairs, picking up groceries, and making sure he never felt alone. I wasn't just visiting that apartment. I was part of the life he built there. But my family never saw it that way. To them, I was simply doing what a daughter should do. And that was the pattern that followed me for years. A pattern I didn't fully understand until it was almost too late. I used to believe that every family had a person who carried more than everyone else. The person who remembered birthdays. The person who made the phone calls, the person who showed up when someone was sick, the person who stayed late cleaning after everyone else had already gone home. I didn't realize that in some families, that person slowly becomes invisible. That was what happened to me. Growing up, I wasn't the daughter my parents worried about. I wasn't the daughter they celebrated. I was the daughter they depended on. And there is a big difference between being valued and being useful. I learned that difference the hard way. When Daniel struggled, my parents called it a difficult season. When I struggled, they called it poor planning. When Daniel changed jobs 3 times in 2 years, my father told everyone he was finding himself. When I worked late nights building my career, my mother told relatives, Emily has always been too serious. She needs to learn how to enjoy life. It was strange hearing people describe me like I was missing something when I was the one holding everything together. One memory that still stays with me happened when my parents needed repairs done on their house. The roof started leaking after a storm, and my father was worried about the cost. I quietly paid part of the repair bill because I knew he was stressed. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't do it because I wanted praise. I did it because he was my father. Months later, during a family dinner, Daniel casually mentioned how he had helped Dad keep things together. Everyone praised him. My mother smiled and said, "That's what families do. They support each other." I sat there silently, because nobody knew I had paid the contractor. Nobody asked, nobody noticed, and eventually I stopped expecting them to. That became my survival strategy. I stopped sharing achievements because they somehow always became smaller after I shared them. When I bought my first small property, I was proud of myself. I had worked for years, saved carefully, and made a responsible investment. I called my parents expecting excitement. Instead, my mother said, "That's nice, Emily, but Daniel is thinking about buying something much bigger." That was the response. Not congratulations, not "we're proud of you." Just another comparison. Over time, I learned to celebrate myself quietly. I built my career, I managed my finances, I created stability, but inside my family, I was still the same person they remembered. The daughter who would help, the daughter who would forgive, the daughter who would never create problems. And that belief became even stronger after my father became sick. During his final years, I spent more time at his apartment than anyone else. I learned his medication schedule, I organized his appointments, I fixed the small things around the apartment that he could no longer manage. I knew which cabinet held his important papers. I knew where he kept his favorite photographs. I knew the exact sound of his footsteps moving across the hardwood floor. Daniel visited, but not often. He always had reasons: work, meetings, personal issues. My mother visited when it was convenient. Rachel came when she felt emotionally prepared. I came because someone needed to come, and I never thought of keeping score. Not until after my father died. That was when everything changed, because suddenly, the same people who had barely noticed my presence started talking about what they believed they deserved. The apartment became the center of every conversation, and the strangest part was that they spoke as if I had never been there. They talked about my father's home, my father's belongings, my father's wishes, but they never asked what my father had actually told me. They never wondered what conversations we had shared. They never considered that maybe the quiet daughter they underestimated knew more than they thought. What they didn't know was that while they were busy deciding my place in the family, I had quietly built a life they knew almost nothing about. For years, they saw me as the daughter who followed instructions. They never realized I had become someone who understood contracts, property records, and legal documents. They never realized that the person they underestimated had spent years preparing without even knowing she was preparing for them. My family thought I was powerless because I was quiet. But silence and weakness are not the same thing. I had learned that lesson long before my father's death, and soon they were going to learn it too. Because there was something about my life they had never bothered to ask about. Something I had built completely on my own. Something that would become the reason their confidence started falling apart. I had a secret they never expected. I was not just the daughter who took care of everyone else. I was the woman who had been preparing herself for the day she finally stopped asking for permission to matter. For most of my life, I thought the hardest part of being overlooked was the loneliness. I was wrong. The hardest part was beginning to question myself. When people repeatedly tell you that you are too sensitive, too emotional, or expecting too much, eventually you start wondering if they are right. For years, I wondered if I was creating problems that weren't there. Maybe I was asking for too much. Maybe I should be more understanding. Maybe family really did mean accepting that some people mattered more than others. But then I met someone who saw everything clearly. Her name was Margaret Harris. Margaret had been my father's estate attorney for almost 2 decades, but she was much more than a lawyer to him. She was one of the few people outside our family who truly knew him. She knew his values, she knew his worries, and she knew something my family never understood. My father noticed things. He may not have always expressed himself perfectly, but he noticed who showed up when things became difficult. Margaret first became close with my father when he was expanding his contracting business. She helped him handle contracts, property purchases, and legal paperwork. Over the years, she became someone he trusted completely. After my father's health started declining, Margaret saw me more often. She saw me sitting in the waiting room during his appointments. She saw me carrying grocery bags into his apartment. She saw me sitting beside him on evenings when he was too tired to talk. One night, after my father had fallen asleep in his recliner, Margaret and I sat at his kitchen table, drinking coffee from 2 old mugs he kept in the cabinet. She looked at me and said something I never forgot. "Emily, do you ever notice that you apologize before you ask for anything?" I laughed because I thought she was joking, but she wasn't. I realized she was right. I had spent so many years trying not to inconvenience anyone that I had forgotten I was allowed to have needs too. I looked down at my coffee and said, "That's just how my family works." Margaret shook her head. "No," she said softly. "That's how they expect you to work." That sentence stayed with me, because there was a difference. My family didn't just want my help. They wanted the version of me who never pushed back. The version of me who stayed quiet. The version of me who made everyone else comfortable. Margaret was also the first person who told me not to panic when my father's condition became worse. She knew he had updated important documents several months before his death. She knew there were decisions he had made privately, but she also knew something important. She wasn't there to create conflict. She wasn't trying to turn me against my family. She simply told me the truth. "Your father wanted his wishes respected," she said. "And respecting his wishes is not the same thing as hurting your family." Those words gave me a strange sense of peace. Because I wasn't trying to win. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I just wanted the truth to matter. After my father passed away, everything became quieter. Too quiet. His apartment felt different without him. The small lamp beside his chair was still there. His reading glasses were still sitting on the table. His favorite blue jacket was still hanging near the door. For a few days, I couldn't bring myself to move anything. It felt like touching those things would mean accepting he was really gone. But while I was grieving, my family had already moved on to something else. The apartment. At first, Daniel mentioned it casually. He called me one evening while I was sorting through my father's papers. "Emily, we should probably talk about Dad's place." I remember standing in the kitchen, holding one of my father's old folders. I said, "What about it?" Daniel responded like the answer was obvious. "I mean, eventually it needs to go to someone who can manage it." I felt something change in that moment. Not anger. Something colder. Awareness. Because he wasn't asking. He was informing me. I asked, "What makes you think you get to decide that?" There was a pause. Then he laughed lightly. "Emily, don't make this complicated. You know how these things work." I knew exactly what he meant. In his mind, he was the oldest child, the son, the person who was supposed to inherit responsibility, and I was still the daughter who would step aside. My mother had the same attitude. When she visited me a few days later, she sat at my kitchen table and said, "Sometimes you have to think about what keeps the family together." I knew that sentence wasn't about family. It was about avoiding conflict. It was about asking me to sacrifice again. I looked at her and asked, "Mom, did Dad ever tell you what he wanted?" She looked away for just a second, and that tiny pause told me more than her answer did. "No," she said, "but we all know him." That was the problem. Everyone thought they knew my father, but very few people had actually listened to him. The days before the estate meeting became a strange waiting period. Daniel started talking about what he would do with the apartment. He mentioned renovations. He talked about furniture. He even told relatives he was taking responsibility for Dad's place. Meanwhile, nobody asked me what I thought. Nobody asked what my father and I had discussed. Nobody asked why I was so calm. Because they were still looking at the old Emily, the daughter who avoided arguments, the daughter who gave in, the daughter who didn't want to disappoint anyone. But they didn't understand something. I had spent years building a life they knew nothing about. And I had spent years learning exactly how important paperwork could be. My career in property management had taught me something my family never expected. Feelings matter, love matters, memories matter, but when people start fighting over ownership, documents matter too. And I had a feeling the documents my father left behind were going to reveal something none of them were prepared to hear. The only question was whether my family would accept the truth, or whether they would fight against it. I used to think the hardest moment would be hearing that my father was gone. And in some ways it was. There is a particular kind of silence that comes after losing someone who was part of your everyday life. The phone stops ringing. The house feels too empty. You find yourself wanting to tell them something small, something meaningless, and then you remember they are not there anymore. But what I didn't expect was that grief would be mixed with disappointment, because while I was trying to accept losing my father, I was also watching my family reveal exactly how they saw me. Not as his daughter who loved him, not as the person who stood beside him, but as an obstacle between them and something they wanted. The estate meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at Margaret's law office downtown. I remember every detail about that day. The gray sky outside, the sound of my shoes on the polished hallway floor, the heavy folder I carried in my hands, the strange feeling of walking into a room where everyone else believed they already knew the ending. Daniel was already there when I arrived. He was wearing a navy suit, the kind he only wore when he wanted people to take him seriously. He stood up when I entered and gave me a small smile. "Hey, Emily." The way he said my name almost sounded caring. Almost, but I had learned something about my family. Sometimes the people who hurt you the most are the ones who know exactly how to appear reasonable. My mother was sitting beside him, holding her purse on her lap. Rachel was across from them, looking down at her phone. Nobody asked how I was doing. Nobody mentioned Dad. Nobody said they missed him. The first thing Daniel said was, "I think we should all try to keep this simple today." I placed my folder on the table. "What does that mean?" He looked surprised that I asked. "It means we don't need unnecessary drama." That word, drama. It was one of my family's favorite words whenever someone finally spoke about being hurt. I looked at him. "Daniel, we haven't even started." He smiled slightly. "Exactly. So let's not make things difficult." I knew what he was doing. He was setting the expectation that any disagreement from me would be the problem. Not the fact that they had already decided my father's apartment belonged to someone else. Not the fact that nobody had asked me. Not the fact that my years of helping my father seemed to disappear the moment ownership became involved. Margaret entered the room a few minutes later, carrying a thick brown envelope and several files. Everyone became quiet. She greeted us professionally, then sat down at the end of the table. "I want to remind everyone that today is about honoring Michael Carter's documented wishes," she said. Daniel nodded confidently. "Of course." But the confidence in his voice bothered me, because he sounded like someone who already knew what those wishes were. Margaret opened her notebook. Before she could say anything else, Daniel leaned forward. "I assume we're discussing the apartment first." Margaret looked at him. "Yes. The apartment is one of the items included in the estate." Daniel nodded. "I figured. Dad always wanted it to stay in the family." I looked at him. "What does that mean?" He turned toward me like I had asked a strange question. "Emily, come on. You know what I mean." "No, I don't." He sighed. "You were helping Dad with the apartment, but that doesn't mean you should take everything personally." I felt my chest tighten, because I knew exactly what he was saying. He was rewriting history. He was taking my love for my father and turning it into something meaningless. "I never said I was taking anything," I replied. Daniel leaned back. "Good. Then we're on the same page." That sentence stayed with me, because he had already decided what my answer was supposed to be. My mother looked at me. "Emily, your brother has a point. He has more experience managing larger responsibilities." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. I had spent years managing responsibilities nobody wanted. Medical appointments, bills, repairs, family emergencies. But suddenly, because Daniel was older and more confident, he was considered the natural choice. Rachel finally spoke. "Mom just means it might be easier." Easier. That word hurt, because what they really meant was easier for them. Easier if I stayed quiet. Easier if I accepted the role they had given me. Easier if nobody had to admit they had underestimated me. Margaret looked at me carefully. I think she noticed something change in my expression. For years, I had tried to explain myself to my family. That day, I stopped. I didn't argue. I didn't defend every memory. I didn't list every sacrifice. I simply said, I want to hear what Dad's documents say. Daniel looked annoyed. My mother looked disappointed. Because they were used to Emily explaining, Emily apologizing, Emily trying to make everyone comfortable, but I was tired of making myself smaller. Margaret opened the first folder. Before reading anything, she looked at all of us. Michael specifically requested that certain documents be reviewed together with all immediate family members present. Daniel smiled. Great, then we can clear this up. He truly believed the next few minutes would prove him right. He believed my father had chosen him. He believed the apartment was already his. He believed I was sitting there because I needed to accept reality. But he didn't know what was inside that folder. None of them did. And when Margaret reached for the final document, I realized something. My father had known exactly what kind of conversation would happen after he was gone. He had prepared for it. And now, for the first time in my life, I wasn't the person waiting to be chosen. I was the person holding the truth. The room became completely silent when Margaret removed the final document from the brown envelope. For a moment, nobody moved. I could hear the quiet hum of the air conditioner above us. I could hear papers shifting under Margaret's hand. I could even hear Daniel tapping his finger lightly against the table, completely confident that the next few minutes would confirm everything he believed. That confidence was almost painful to watch. Because for years, Daniel had never considered the possibility that he might be wrong. Margaret adjusted her glasses and looked down at the document. This is the updated transfer agreement and estate instruction prepared by Michael Carter 6 months before his passing. Daniel smiled. There it is. My mother looked relieved. Rachel glanced between us, but Margaret continued. According to this document, the apartment located at 214 Willow Street was legally transferred into Emily Carter's name as part of Michael's estate planning. Nobody spoke. Not immediately. It was as if the sentence entered the room but nobody knew how to react to it. Daniel blinked. I watched his expression change. First confusion, then disbelief, then something closer to anger. What? Margaret calmly repeated herself. The apartment belongs to Emily. Daniel laughed once. Not because he found it funny, because he couldn't accept it. No, that's not possible. Margaret looked at him. It is possible. The documents were properly prepared, signed and notarized. Daniel looked at my mother. This doesn't make sense. My mother stared at the papers. Emily? The way she said my name almost sounded like I had done something wrong, like I was responsible for the decision my father made. I looked at her and said quietly, I didn't create this, Mom. Margaret continued explaining the details. She showed the transfer records, she showed the signatures, she showed the timeline. My father had not made some last-minute emotional decision. He had carefully planned everything. The apartment was not something he accidentally left behind. It was something he intentionally gave me. Because I had been there. Because I had helped him maintain it. Because I understood how much that home meant to him. Daniel pushed the papers slightly away. So Dad just decided this without telling us? Margaret looked at him. Your father was not required to get permission from anyone before making his own estate decisions. That sentence hit him harder than the document itself. Because that was the part my family struggled with most. They believed my father's choices should match their expectations. They believed family tradition mattered more than his personal wishes. Daniel leaned forward. Emily must have convinced him. There it was. The accusation I knew would come. Not that my father made a choice, not that he trusted me, but that I somehow manipulated him. I looked at Daniel. Do you really believe Dad couldn't make his own decisions? He didn't answer. Because answering honestly would mean admitting something uncomfortable. My father was not controlled by me. He simply saw me. Margaret opened another file. I also have records showing Emily's involvement with the apartment over several years. She placed copies on the table. repair invoices, maintenance records, emails, messages between my father and me, proof that I had been there, proof that I had helped, proof that the things my family dismissed as just helping Dad were actually years of responsibility. My mother picked up one of the papers. Her eyes moved across the page. For the first time, I saw something different in her expression. Not anger, not disappointment, recognition. Maybe she was finally seeing the things she had ignored. Rachel whispered, "You paid for that repair?" I nodded. "Part of it." She looked uncomfortable. "I didn't know," I almost smiled sadly. "I know. Because that was the entire problem. Nobody knew, nobody asked, nobody wanted to know. They only saw the version of me that benefited them." Daniel stood up from his chair. "So what? She gets the apartment and everyone just accepts it?" Margaret remained calm. "That is how legally documented wishes work." He looked at me. "You're really going to let this happen?" That question surprised me. Not because he asked it, because it showed exactly how he thought. He still believed I was doing something to him. He still believed I was taking something away. But I wasn't taking anything. I was finally refusing to give away something that was already mine. I looked at him and said, "Daniel, this isn't happening because of me. This is happening because Dad made a decision." The room went quiet again. For years, I had waited for someone in my family to defend me. That day, I realized I was finally capable of defending myself. But the hardest part was still coming, because documents could prove ownership. They could prove facts, but they could not erase years of pain. And before that meeting ended, I needed to say something I had never been brave enough to say before. I needed them to understand that the apartment was never the thing that hurt me most. It was everything that happened before it. After the estate meeting, I thought the hardest part was over. I was wrong, because losing the apartment had never been Daniel's biggest fear. The apartment was only a symbol. What he really feared was losing control of the story. For years, my family had told a version where Daniel was the responsible one, where I was the emotional one, where I was the daughter who helped but never led. And now, in front of Margaret, that story was falling apart. The consequences started almost immediately. Daniel called relatives before I even got home. I know because my phone started receiving messages. Some people asked if everything was okay. Others asked why there was conflict over Dad's apartment. Conflict. That word appeared again. The same word my family always used whenever someone finally stopped accepting unfair treatment. I didn't respond to most of them. I had learned something important. Not every misunderstanding deserves a defense. Some people only understand the truth after they see the evidence. And some people choose not to understand at all. Daniel continued telling people that I had taken advantage of Dad's situation. But the problem with that story was simple. The documents did not support him. The timeline did not support him. The witnesses did not support him. And eventually, people who had only heard his version began asking questions. My mother struggled the most, because unlike Daniel, she could not pretend the evidence did not exist. She started remembering things. The nights I spent at my father's apartment, the appointments I arranged, the repairs I handled, the small sacrifices I made that nobody celebrated. One evening, she called me. Her voice sounded different. Tired, almost uncertain. "Emily," she said. "I didn't realize how much you had done." I sat quietly for a moment. Because part of me had waited years to hear those words. But another part of me wondered why it took losing my father and reading legal documents for my mother to finally see me. I said, "Mom, that was the part that hurt." She was silent. I wasn't upset because Dad left me the apartment. I was hurt because everyone assumed I deserved nothing. The truth was finally out. But truth has a strange way of changing everything. It doesn't always bring people together. Sometimes it simply reveals who was willing to see you all along. And as my family struggled with the consequences of their own assumptions, I had to decide something much harder. Was I going to keep waiting for them to become the family I needed? Or was I finally going to build a life where I didn't have to beg to be valued? For a long time after the estate meeting, I expected some kind of dramatic ending. I thought maybe my family would finally sit down and admit everything. I thought my mother would say, "Emily, we were wrong." I thought Daniel would realize that all those years of underestimating me had hurt more than he understood. But real life is rarely that simple. Sometimes the people who hurt you don't suddenly become different people. Sometimes they just become quieter when they realize they can no longer control the situation. That was what happened with my family. The apartment was legally mine, the documents were clear, the truth had been revealed. But emotional wounds do not disappear just because paperwork proves you were right. For months after the estate meeting, Daniel found different ways to contact me. At first, he was angry. He sent messages saying things like, "I can't believe you're doing this to the family." Doing this to the family. That phrase stayed with me, because once again, he made my boundaries sound like an attack. I wanted to respond. I wanted to explain everything. I wanted to remind him of every hospital visit, every repair, every night I spent helping Dad. But then I stopped, because I realized something. I had spent my whole life explaining my value to people who benefited from pretending not to see it. I didn't owe anyone another explanation. A few weeks later, Daniel's messages changed. The anger became guilt. I know things got out of hand. Maybe we both misunderstood each other. You know how Mom feels about family being together. The words sounded softer. But the message underneath was the same. He wanted everything to return to normal. And normal meant me going back to the role I had always played. The helper, the peacemaker, the person who swallowed her feelings so everyone else could stay comfortable. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want my family to suffer. I simply didn't want to disappear anymore. My mother also tried to reconnect. Her approach was different. She wasn't as aggressive as Daniel. She was more emotional. One evening, she called me and cried. She said, "I just don't understand how we got here." I sat in my apartment, looking around at the walls my father had chosen, the bookshelf he had built himself, and the small framed picture of us sitting on the balcony years earlier. I took a deep breath. "Mom, we got here because nobody listened until there was something valuable involved." She was quiet. For once, she didn't argue. I continued. "I loved Dad before there was an apartment. I loved him when he was sick. I loved him when nobody was watching." My voice started shaking. But I kept going. "And I need you to understand something. I'm not angry because Daniel wanted the apartment. I'm hurt because everyone acted like my relationship with Dad didn't matter." That was the first time I stopped protecting everyone else's feelings. And strangely, it felt peaceful. Not easy, not painless, but peaceful. Rachel was the only person who slowly started seeing things differently. She called me one afternoon and admitted something I never expected. "I think I spent years believing the version of you everyone else told me." That sentence meant more than she probably realized, because sometimes healing begins when someone finally admits they were looking at you through someone else's eyes. I didn't suddenly rebuild a perfect relationship with my family. That wasn't realistic. Trust does not return because someone says sorry once. It returns through changed behavior. And I had learned that words were easy, actions were what mattered. So I created boundaries. I stopped discussing the apartment. I stopped defending my choices. I stopped accepting guilt disguised as love. I told my family something simple. I want a relationship with people who see me as a person, not just someone who can help when things get difficult. That became my boundary. And for the first time in my life, I kept it. A year after my father's death, I stood inside the apartment that had caused so much conflict. But it no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like home. I had renovated parts of it. I repaired the old kitchen cabinets. I repainted the living room. I kept my father's favorite chair near the window because I couldn't bring myself to remove it. Some people might have seen the apartment as a victory, a possession, a piece of property I won, but that was never what it meant to me. The apartment represented something much deeper. It represented being seen. For years, I thought I needed my family to finally choose me. I thought I needed them to say I was important. I thought I needed their approval. But my father's final document taught me something different. My worth was never created by that document. The document simply revealed what had already been true. I mattered. My love mattered. My effort mattered. My presence mattered. Even when nobody was applauding, even when nobody was paying attention, I still mattered. I started building a different kind of life after that. A life surrounded by people who appreciated me, without needing me to earn my place. Friends who checked on me because they cared. Coworkers who respected my knowledge. People who asked how I was doing and actually waited for the answer. I stopped chasing a seat at tables, where I was only invited when someone needed something. I created my own table, and that changed everything. Looking back now, I realize my father's final gift was not the apartment. It was the reminder that I was never invisible. I was simply surrounded by people who refused to see me, and sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop trying to convince people of your value. The right people will recognize it. The wrong people will only understand it after they lose access to it. If you have ever been the person in your family who was expected to stay quiet, to forgive everything, or to keep giving without receiving, I hope my story reminds you that your kindness does not make you weak. Your patience does not mean you have no limits. And protecting your peace is not selfish. It is necessary. If this story connected with you, share your experience in the comments. Sometimes the stories we are afraid to tell are the ones that remind someone else they are not alone. And if you want to hear more stories about finding strength after betrayal, consider subscribing, because sometimes the greatest inheritance we receive is not a house, money, or anything written on paper. Sometimes the greatest inheritance is finally learning that we were worthy all along.